Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. So in my last philosophical episode, I talked about inverse hypocrisy. How even if we are practicing what we preach, if that activity is only a small subset of how we spend our time, it creates the appearance of a disconnect between what we're preaching and what we're practicing, what we say and what we're actually doing or how we're actually spending our time. So just as a sort of example or an exercise, I thought it would be good for me to sit down and analyze how I spend my time and why I do what I do. So what do? Well, I build guns. Actually, I build a lot of things. Inventing has always been a passion of mine, and firearms certainly have been a focus area of my inventing, although I've built and tinkered with all kinds of things over the years. Now, I've made other videos about the social virtues of freelance invention of firearms and home gun building, some of the ways that can benefit society in a socio-political context. But in a more fundamental spiritual context, if we go back to the creation account in Genesis, we read how God created man in his own image, from which I infer that man's original purpose on this earth was to glorify God by reflecting his image or his nature. Well, God is the creator, so one way in which man bears the image of God is his capacity for creativity. And one way in which man can glorify God by reflecting his nature is through creative expression. And so, for me, inventing things, engineering and craftsmanship, taking an idea and turning it into at least an interesting project, and hopefully in the end a useful product, is really one of the foremost ways in which I can worship God. And, when I'm out in the shop, putting the skills and creativity that God has given me to good use, there's almost a sense of fellowship with God in that, act of creation. As though God is creating things through his people, as it were. So I think engineering and inventing and craftsmanship, when they're pursued in a wholesome and constructive manner, are a great way in which we can worship God. So what else do I like to do? Well, I love to get out and explore the out of doors, out where men are men and God is God and the thankless din of modern civilization is sufficiently muted that one can more easily hear creation declaring the majesty of its creator. The nature of God, his power and his love is evident in the world that he has created, and in the beauty of his creation. So it's almost always spiritually refreshing to get out in the great outdoors and listen to nature's testimony about its creator. Another thing that I try to spend time doing regularly is target practice. Now, I've made other videos talking about my views on the morality of self-defense. I'm not going to rehash all of that here today. But suffice it to say that I believe there are situations in which the use of deadly force might be morally warranted, and to that end, I frequently carry a firearm. Not that I necessarily expect to find myself in any of those situations. Certainly if I knew where these situations would arise, if I knew where all of the muggers and serial killers and rabid grizzly bears and so forth were, I could just avoid those encounters or contact the authorities and let them deal with the problem. But I don't have that information, and so I'm obliged to carry a firearm in the event of the unexpected. But in carrying a firearm, I carry with it the responsibility to maintain sufficient proficiency with it that I can use it effectively should the need arise. And I take that responsibility very seriously. And the only way to maintain proficiency with a firearm is through regular practice. I think one good session of target practice a month is probably about the bare minimum to claim that you're maintaining proficiency and carrying a gun responsibly. Once every other week would certainly be better. Every week would be exemplary. Every day would probably be excessive for most of us. At this point, I get in about 1 to 2 sessions a month, so I'll admit I have some room for improvement in this area. If I could get up to every other week or even every week, that certainly would be better. But I do spend some time doing this, and I do think it's warranted. Let's see, another thing that I spend time doing regularly is going to church. The Bible commands us not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together. Moreover, it likens the church to the body of Christ, and the members of the church to members of that body. Well, if you have a member of a human body, whether it's a finger or a hand or an eye or an ear, no matter how good that member is, if it's disconnected from the body, there's going to be problems, both for the member and for the body that it's disconnected from. So it's important for members to have that connection with the body or with a local church assembly. How exactly it's beneficial or important for members to have that local church connection, or what functions the church is supposed to perform, could be the subject of a rather lengthy discourse. And I may make an episode about that, once I have a chance to study up on that subject a little bit more myself, because I think that is something that would be interesting to research a little more in the biblical text. But we'll reserve that for a separate episode once I've done my homework in that regard. Another thing I've been spending some time doing recently was going through the book of Psalms and writing a psalter, trying to paraphrase the Psalms so that they're more singable in English. And even before that, sometimes I would spend time, writing lyrics or poetry or even just singing existing songs, usually of a spiritual nature. If studying God's Word and singing His praise isn't glorifying to Him, then what is? So, hopefully that one is pretty self-explanatory. And finally, one thing that I've spent a lot of time doing, and I suspect you have too, is work. How does that fit into all this? Well, for starters, in the Ten Commandments, talking about the Sabbath, the biblical text actually says, 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the seventh is the Sabbath of the Lord. In it ye shall do no work. So under the Mosaic law, there were actually 2 parts to keeping the Sabbath. First, you had to do all of your work in 6 days. You had to work hard enough for 6 days that you could get all of your week's worth of work done in that period of time. And then you would take the 7th day off as a day of rest and worship. Then in Proverbs we read an abundance of admonitions to avoid laziness and to be diligent in our work. And then in the New Testament we find the admonition that if any man provide not for his own, he hath denied the faith. So we have a strong biblical precedent for the idea that man is supposed to spend a great deal of his time, probably about 6/7 of his waking hours, working. and that the head of a household has a God-given responsibility to provide for that household. In fact, if he's not willing to shoulder that God-given responsibility, then he can't call himself a Christian, per the letter of our text. Now, there's any number of specific ways that that could play out. We think of a family in biblical times practicing what we would now call subsistence farming, where there's plenty of work to be done on the farm, and, the man does some of that work himself, and some of it he delegates to his wife, and some of it he delegates to his children, but he still bears the responsibility to make sure that they'll have enough. In modern times, there's, if anything, an even greater diversity of ways it could play out. We have the classical scenario where the man works a day job and brings in all the money himself, and his wife is a full-time homemaker. But there might be other cases where a man is called to a particular venue of ministry that's important but not particularly lucrative, and God has gifted him with a wife who has a more lucrative career. And so the man is able to delegate most of the financial responsibility for his household to her and still make sure that his household is adequately taken care of while spending most of his time, working in a field of ministry that may not be directly generating revenue. With all of the opportunities now for small businesses and family businesses and e-commerce and advertising and so on and so forth, there's any of a myriad of different ways that could work out specifically. The point, though, is simply this. One, that a man has a God-given responsibility to ensure that his household is taken care of, and two, that it's part of God's design for man to spend the majority of his time working. Now, as I said earlier, man is created in the image of his Creator, and so one of the ways in which man can glorify God, is through creative activities, things like engineering and craftsmanship. And so, ideally, a man's work, should also be his worship, a way to glorify God in wholesome, creative, productive activity. There are some jobs where you do that kind of work, and there's a lot of jobs where I'm afraid that kind of work is the exception rather than the rule. Now, even in the case of jobs where you're not so much being creative and productive at work, there could well be an impetus to work the job, one, to provide for your family and meet your God-given responsibilities, and two, perhaps to be there as some kind of witness or to minister to people that you come in contact with through that position. But I think we need to be careful not to use that argument as a cop-out. And I'm sort of in an experimental, transitional phase here in my own employment where I'm hoping to increase the percentage of my workday that is spent in wholesome, creative, productive work. So I'll probably have more to say on this next year or, once my job situation is crystallized a little more. But until then, thank you for watching The Idahoan Show.